I have to tell you that one of the high points I've had right now, and I'll acknowledge, is that Ben Horowitz is almost as our entire family, I think, is here today. Can you point them out and just sort of say who's here?
You know, the lights are so bright I can't even see them. Where are you?
Where are they? Over there. So who you got here, Ben?
Well, I've got my wife, my mother-in-law, my brother, my nephew.
How about that?
Oh, and my mom. My mom's
You
here
don't
too.
forget your mom, for
mom.
God's sake. It's just wonderful. You know, I think in a lot of respects, all roads lead to Andreessen Horowitz in some form, or if they don't, it's awfully close. And it's all happened in, what, 3 years now? I mean, it's just an unbelievable kind of a thing. But the best example that I had that really sort of blew me away is that we were at a small gathering not long ago, and I started to notice that every sort of rock star in the technology and the entrepreneurial business, at some point when you start talking to them and they said, you know, I had this problem, it was a strategic problem, or it was a tactical problem, or an operational problem, at some point they said, then I went to see Ben Horowitz. And when I talked to Ben, he helped me think it through and worked it out. It was just one, you know, Donahoe, who's here before, talked about Ben, would quote Ben. Dick Costello would quote about the things they learned from Ben. And so it's just an amazing sort of level of insight that you brought to bear.
Yeah, I'm glad that everybody is learning from all my mistakes. They were extremely painful.
We got a very interesting audience here, and obviously, Ben, so much of what you've done and has built has been on the premise of the unbelievable technology and innovation in Silicon Valley. But one of the things I'd love to start with, if I could, is just talking to you. In the last 10 or 15 years, what the folks in this room have been building and doing in emerging markets around the world are pretty extraordinary. I mean, I think even 10 years ago, if we were sitting here and would look at the adoption of mobile technology and what people are doing at the caliber of entrepreneurship, I'm not sure we would have necessarily predicted it. And I'm just sort of curious, you know, what's been your overview? What have you seen that sort of surprised you in the last decade in that way?
Yeah, well, the first thing that was surprising is actually how long it took. In that, you know, I think we saw the first WAP. Do you guys remember WAP? The first WAP browser, which was on a phone in 1996 when we were at Netscape. And it worked, you know, like you go on the internet and do stuff. It was pretty awesome. But it kind of just lay there dormant, or not dormant, you know, there were internet-connected phones the whole way, but it didn't really change anything other than email. So you had email in your pocket. And so it took a very, very long time, and then it changed all of a sudden, which tends to be how these things go. They take much longer than you would expect, and then when they happen much faster than you would think. And then the other thing that's a little surprising to me is the way the breakthrough occurred. So, and it probably shouldn't have been, but you know, we were always thinking of it as like, eventually like bandwidth and processing power gets to like where the products get better. But it was kind of the thing that made it happen very quickly was Apple took this chance where they said, look, you know, it's not a phone, and we don't have to hit a phone price point. It's a computer, and like the phone is probably the least interesting application, and so we're going to take a big jump from everything that had been done, and we're going to put an actual like real operating system on it. And what I mean by real is that you can develop very high quality software to it. So unlike, you know, BlackBerry OS was, or unlike Symbian was, where you could do trivial things but not really solve the hard problems. And then by doing that, they were able to build a user experience that was really breakthrough. And up until that point, I think that most of us didn't even realize how compromised the old user experiences were. And so, and then of course, then once it happened, then here we are.
Would you have expected that literally in some of these countries that are represented here, as much as 100% mobile penetration, just even before we talk smartphones, which I'll come back to in a second, but I think that took even people in the industry by utter surprise.
You know, I think so, because the value proposition is so amazing. You know, connectivity to the world is a really big deal. And then once you get to a smartphone, I mean, for those of us who grew up with computers and watched, you know, at first you needed millions of dollars in a refrigerated room, and to have more power than that in your pocket, and then have it connected to the world so that literally the world is in your pocket, including like the entire Library of Congress and every bit of music that was ever recorded, and every scientific paper, and like that is just an amazing amount of value. Like at any other point in time, that would have been worth, you know, somebody might have paid, you know, $500 million for it, and to be able to get it for a few $100 and then a monthly service charge, yeah, that'd be the first thing that I would buy if I was anywhere in the world. It's better than a car, it's better than anything. So that part, to me, hasn't been surprising.
Your partner, Mark, he actually wrote in my forward, but has said it repeatedly, that, in the next 8 years, 10 years, pick your time, there'll be 5 billion smartphones on the planet. To your point, these are not communication devices alone, these are not entertainment devices, this is supercomputing capacity in the hands of 2/3 of humanity within a decade. What does that look like? What do you think about when you think about that?
Well, I think I think it's starting to get like super exciting, and we kind of the neat thing about being in the computer industry is when I started as a computer science student in the early '80s, and then when I went to work at Silicon Graphics, the first thing that you realized in those days was computers were really, really amazing at building computers. And it's hard, but we used to, when we designed circuits, we'd have like colored pencils, and like we'd be drawing them. Like in school, you'd have these colored pencils, and you would draw the circuits out, and you'd try and figure it out and do the calculations. And that was like chip design that way, and then chip design on a computer with like a Silicon Graphics machine and software from Cadence or something like that was just night and day. And you're like, wow, these computers are going to be really important because like look how good they are at making computers. And we've seen kind of the same thing with the internet, where if you look at the evolution of programming languages from, again, like probably the early '80s to kind of the late '90s, there was almost no change because, they're very sticky. You need them to be highly performant and optimized and all these kinds of things. So there wasn't really any advance until kind of the internet and open source. And then in the last 10 years, there's been more progress in terms of what you get as a programmer than there were like in the whole history of computing before that. And, and that's because you now have like everybody working on a programming language. So like if you're writing something in Python, the number of people who have contributed to what you're writing is just enormous. Yeah. And, and I think programming languages are the first thing, but if you think about that in physics or biology or any field, what's possible now, where before you were working in isolation or working with maybe, a couple of guys in your lab, to now you're working with the world, that's probably the most exciting thing that's going on, and I think that despite what some people think and have written, I think we're probably on the verge of the kind of biggest set of scientific breakthroughs that the world has ever seen, and it's all because we have 5 billion people. Now, like all the creative, smart people in the world can play, as opposed to the people at MIT or the people at Stanford or these like super elite environments.
So if the entire world can play, and if talent is everywhere, as we know that it is, and you've told me about 100 times, it's a very interesting observation. The great entrepreneurs are great entrepreneurs. Doesn't matter where they are. You put them in the same room, they think differently, the same way. They work through problems the same way, that kind of a thing. We are talking about then a revolution about parts of the world that maybe have not been acknowledged before. Your brothers and sisters in Silicon Valley, some of them over the last 15, 20 years, have gone so far as to open offices in different corners of the world. Yep. Others try to do it by a plane. But there's this sort of feeling that something's happening out there. How's it been going, do you think? And how do you think it could be going thereafter?
Well, so, and there's two different things. There's like, okay, are great things being invented worldwide, and then are there like super valuable companies being built worldwide? And I think on the former, it's gone exceptionally well. So, and not just so, there's venture capitalists who have gone and invested in other countries and, in the developing world. And then there's big companies that have, built development offices there. And the latter has worked exceptionally well. And great software is being built all over the world. And just like the breakthroughs in Eastern Europe have been stunning and amazing. And that's happened at an incredibly fast rate. On the other hand, in terms of really big companies, there have been software products. We were talking backstage about, Estonia built Skype, and that was quite amazing. And Israel certainly produced a few very significant companies. But by and large, if you look at the smart people outside of kind of the US and then outside of Silicon Valley, and what's been produced from a like venture capital return standpoint, and then what's happened in Silicon Valley, it's still extremely lopsided. So if you look at, okay, in the last decade, what are the companies that have been created that are worth more than $10 billion? And you go through the list as well: Facebook, LinkedIn, Workday, depending on what day, Tesla, probably Twitter, depending on what it is. And then, those are all, in a 100-mile radius of each other. And then, what are the ones that were created outside of that 100-mile radius? And it's kind of hard to think of them. So that part hasn't, I would say, gone as well or worked as well.
When you're a venture capitalist, particularly one of your capacity and caliber, that criteria seems to be quite wonderful and important from an investment theory perspective.
Yes.
It's a big world out there, and there are lots of ways to make money and lots of very interesting, innovative people. Mm-hmm. Is that the criteria by which to judge, one, economic opportunity, and secondly, ecosystem building?
Well, I think that, and I'm speaking as a Silicon Valley venture capitalist, so for our business, right, that's all the returns, the way venture capital works, it's an extreme parallel curve, and all the returns, the bulk of the returns are in those companies. So if you look at, in any given year, the top 15 companies will return 90% of the market cap for that class of companies, and of the 1,000 started. And so, those are the ones that you have to be in if you're kind of serious about venture capital. Now, that's not to say that there's no return anywhere else. And it's also, when you're talking about those companies, you're talking about the global winners. So who's going to build the social network with 1 billion people on it is a different question than things that are valuable to society. My wife does a lot of work in India, and one of the laws in India that there's a law, and I'm trying to remember exactly how it works, but basically there's a right to work, so that if you don't have a job, there'll be funding for you to work for a few months and get paid at some job doing something to help the infrastructure of the country. But people getting access just to do the paperwork to do those jobs is a huge problem. And so a kid from MIT went back to India and built a system so that people could get to their right to work. And that's an amazingly valuable thing to create. It's probably not a venture capital project, but there's a lot of things that are happening on that scale. And then I think there's also, these are big countries. Alibaba in China, they're going to go public. People think they're going to be worth $100 billion. So, and they don't really play outside of China. But if you are in a country with more than 1.5 billion people, and you win that country, that's awfully significant. And I think that there are a lot of opportunities like that won't necessarily be the same as something like that you might find here.
Do you see Silicon Valley? So Linda has this wonderful term, E to E, emerging market to emerging market. And generally what she's saying is that a lot of the people in this room, when they become successful, are investing in the next generation, both within their countries and within the regions. And then you've got things like what you just described in Tencent and other stuff in China, Baidu, where
Right.
people within ecosystems, because they're so large, are building it. So does this mean Silicon Valley just says, well, go ahead, you guys do that, we're not going to play? Or how do you think about those opportunities that are being built from an investor perspective, and particularly a Silicon Valley perspective?
Yeah, if there are kind of really important market opportunities in emerging markets, I think it's pretty unlikely that Silicon Valley company is going to be the one to find them, or that is a real playing field leveler, in the sense that when we see companies, a huge criteria for us investing is does the entrepreneur know something that nobody else knows? Do they have some secret that makes what their idea much better than you might think? And that's what leads to the really big outcomes. A good example of this is my friend Drew Houston built this company, Dropbox, and at the time, when he was originally raising money, there were 30 guys who were doing the same thing. It's, oh yeah, storage in the cloud. It's a very obvious idea. But the thing that he knew from, one, going to MIT and being a brilliant computer scientist and messing around with it, is to kind of, it was a very hard technical problem, and getting all the synchronization right, the user interface right, and the cross-platform right, and all those things was an incredible challenge. And so by knowing what nobody else knew and tackling that problem in the right way, he ended up building a really important company. I think the same thing is applicable to if you're an emerging market entrepreneur and you see a market that you understand better than anybody else, or you understand the problem better than anybody else, or how people are going to actually buy or use or get value out of the solution, then that's going to be an opportunity that you're advantaged in, and that's a big deal. But like going after a market that like people in Silicon Valley are going after and understand and have like 100 times as much money as you and access to like all the best engineers in the world, like that's a more difficult proposition.
So it's interesting because I've talked to, again, your sisters and brothers in a lot of this, and some of whom, have open offices all over the world. I think some of them say that they've gone better than some of them have gone. A few of them have put a couple of decent pelts on the wall and that kind of stuff. But what is so interesting to me is that when I pull on the string of this question, they'll say almost to a person the same thing over and over again. One, we got to go where market cap is going to be big. So we may lose our ass in China for a decade, but we got to be in China. And or two, if we can outsource something cheaply, then we're really interested in that kind of stuff. And I say, okay, that's fine, and maybe that's what got you wherever you are or you think you are now. But is that really the way to think about the opportunity of these markets in the next 10 or 15 years versus the way they've been thinking about it in the previous 15?
Well, I think they end up being different venture capital firms that succeed in those regions. I just think it's a different thing, right? Like if you're a Silicon Valley venture capital firm, like, starting from the size of your fund to the kinds of people that you hire to what you know, you have a return profile and a kind of type of company that you're looking for that's extremely specific. And that's a different kind of company than you're going to find in other places. I mean, and like I think a lot of the guys who went into China found that out, even though China kind of looks similar. Turns out their kind of version of things is different, like the way the law works and all these kinds of things, which like matter. There's no concept of guanji in the U.S., and like you have to have a lot of that to succeed in business in China. So like these things matter, and differences matter, and you have to understand them. You have to be an expert in them. You have to be best in the world at that. And so I think it's different venture capitalists would be my prediction.
So you've talked and written beautifully about, and very provocatively about, ecosystem and the network effect of talent, which has very much been about Silicon Valley.
Right.
There is something that's going on, and I wonder what you're reacting about it, which is that a lot of the classic, first of all, I'd love just you to give a quick overview. What do you think is the most important thing in an ecosystem? And secondly, thinking again about the future 10 years in technology as opposed to where we've been today, are there changes where that despite the ecosystem, where in some countries that you're not going to get the education system put up to a standard that you may look for in an ideal Silicon Valley way in the next 10 or 15 years, but now people are doing so many interesting things, educating themselves, using technology, in a very interesting open source kind of way. Can you do this despite the ecosystem, or do you think that the ecosystem will look different as you think about it in the next 10 years?
Well, it's really depending on like do what. I think is the big thing, like do what. And so, look, there's no question that like right now today there are like very, very smart people who are amazing programmers outside of Silicon Valley. And that, that continues. But look, we should talk a little bit about what the network effect means, because like there's great, actors and actresses outside of Hollywood. There's great, like filmmakers and so forth, but yet like all the big movies tend to get made in Hollywood, and all the kind of big tech companies tend to get made in Silicon Valley. And why is that? And it's a lot easier to actually make a movie than make a tech company, I should point out. And so like what is it about this network effect, and where does it come from? And what does it mean? And so it really comes down to like if you have a great idea, and then you are a great entrepreneur, and by great entrepreneur, a lot of what being a great entrepreneur is about, and I've written about, is like you have to build a company. Like it's not a choice. It's not like you wake up and say, oh, should I build a company or should I become a cook? Like like you have to build a company, and it has to be an important company. And if today in the world, you wake up and that's how you're feeling, and you look at the world and you go, oh, look, Andy Bechtolsheim and Peter Thiel and Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and Drew Houston all like live within like a very short distance of each other. Should I go there where like clearly all the best engineers are like the concentration of great talent is, or should I like stay home? And so if you're the entrepreneur who says I have to go there, you're probably the one that I want to invest in. You're probably the one that's going to win because you're the one who cares about nothing else in life other than building that company. And like maybe that's not a good way to be philosophically, but like that's what it takes to win. You know, and just like the fact that like Mark Zuckerberg dropped out of Harvard and moved to Silicon Valley, like, you know, like he didn't stay in Boston, he moved to Silicon Valley, like that's interesting. And then, so then once all those people are there, what happens is the expectation and the ambition of companies in the region is just higher than anywhere else. And my friend and business partner, Chris Dixon, has this thing that he was telling me the other day. He's like, you know, Twitter and Tumblr are a pretty good A/B test. Yeah. Like almost the same idea, almost the same product, same growth rate, same initial investor, $1 billion outcome, and one that's probably worth 10 billion going to 20 billion. Like, what's the difference? And you know, and that's Silicon Valley versus New York. And like New York is considered a really good startup area, but the level of expectation and ambition and like what you do in terms of building the world-beating company is just higher in Silicon Valley than anywhere else. So that's kind of the network effect and the ecosystem that you're talking about. And kind of replicating that somewhere else is a huge challenge because like the next great entrepreneur, the next great engineer is just so much more likely to go to Silicon Valley than anywhere else. So if you're trying to build a company like that, that is hard to do outside. It's been done, but like not at anywhere near the rate. But if you're trying to solve like a very important problem in a specific country or set of countries that people aren't addressing or these kinds of things, you know, that's a more viable, you have more time, you have more knowledge. These things are different, but I do think they end up being different investors and different entrepreneurs.
But again, if we were to look more towards the next 10 years, and I, you know, as obvious, you see three kinds of folks when I have this conversation when I'm out around the world, and there are folks that would sell their left leg to get to Silicon Valley if they can, and you are backing some of them remarkable people that I know. Mm-hmm. There are people that love to visit, like to spend time there, but are hoping to leverage something and bring it back, maybe a business development, what have you. But I think progressively, and I think some statistics are beginning to back this out because there's so much broader societal change that's going on in many ways, is folks want to stay home. And it's not just because they don't care about their business, they don't want it in their teeth, yeah. They don't want to win, because I got to tell you, you're sitting in a room now of some of the most tenacious winners I've ever met anywhere at any time. Yeah. But there are lots of reasons to want to be home, some of which is I want to build an ecosystem there. Maybe let's concede it may or may not be what Silicon Valley is today, but it could be very important and it could be very successful, and these are large markets and I can make a lot of money, but I also could help build a great country. I mean, there are lots of other things that are going on. And so again, I want to push about in the next 10 years, is there a dynamic that's important, that we can all concede that Silicon Valley will remain what it is, but is there something else that's going to be happening in multiple locations that should be thought about differently? And by the way, facilitated by access to technology.
Yeah, look, I hope so. I mean, you know, I hope that the world would be a much better place if there were 10 or 100 Silicon Valleys. Like that would be better than it all being like in one area, and it'd be a lot less like traffic, and housing might not be so expensive too, and there'd be other good things about it. And like maybe it breaks down over time, or maybe, you know, I gave the Hollywood example before. Bollywood is actually, with the changes in the economics of movies, like turns out people like to watch movies in India a lot more than they do in the US now. And so Bollywood is kind of getting pretty serious as a place to make them. But, you know, look, a lot of us would like to stay home. I'd like to stay home, but a big distinguishing thing between the people who build, like, you know, Thomas Edison or Henry Ford or, you know, or Dave Packard or Mark Zuckerberg, is that the company is the thing. Like, more than anything else is the thing. And those are the guys who seem to build the biggest companies. Those are the people who build the biggest companies. So, you know, I'm not convinced that all of a sudden changes. And so I think that it will still, I mean, like, it's not changed yet. I would have expected that there would be someplace else with at least 5 or 10 important companies that got built out of that region. I mean, like really important, long-lasting companies. I mean, we build a lot of not important companies in Silicon Valley today, but like it hasn't happened yet. So to predict it's going to happen is a little tricky in that I don't know what makes it happen. But look, people are going to be doing really interesting things around the world, and those are going to both like help the economy in the local area. I mean, India is like a completely different place. Just on like, if you just took the Indian engineers working for US-based companies, like that's been transformational. And then once you have that, then you start to get the knowledge to build your own companies. And I think that'll be transformational, at least first locally. And then maybe it becomes transformational globally, but that's a little, like whether that's in 5 years or 10 years or when that happens, or whether, you know, like Silicon Valley's got to decline like the Roman Empire first. I don't know, but.
Yeah,
apparently, according to my friend George Packer, that's maybe coming soon.
Yeah, I sometimes never understand why the rise of other, I mean, this is a true in politics as it is in business, why the rise of something must mean by definition the decline of something else, particularly with the dynamics that are changing so much. So that part of it I never quite understood.
Well, you know, and this kind of gets to, there aren't like a lot of cases of very local technology companies. It tends to be like if you build a technology company, it competes globally. And so in that way, you have to get to world class. And, you know, if there are very big markets and you're competing with the best companies in the world, like right now, that means at least to some degree you have to be as good as a Silicon Valley company. Now, there are a lot of cases where there wasn't a good Silicon Valley company, or like something else happened, or you know, you have Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos and like you build a giant company in Seattle, and those have been like pretty spectacular. So it's not like a hard and fast rule or anything, but you know, building a place that repeatably produces large companies, which is part of the question you're asking me, you know, that's harder. Like that's harder to see like when that happens or how that happens or what happens.
We would not have necessarily predicted that consumer electronics and mobile capacity would have been blown out in places like Japan or Korea or Finland. Now Finland's got its own, Nokia's got its own problems, but notwithstanding that it rose as it did,
Sure.
I don't think I would have called 20 years ago and all. And Seattle's an interesting thing. It's interesting that some very powerful e-commerce companies are in fact not from the Valley, but different parts of the United States. I mean, Tony's in Las Vegas doing great and that kind of thing. And so is there something inherently different about software versus kind of hardware, consumer electronics, and e-commerce? And is there any ideas of, again, how software might be the answer to your question of I don't know what triggers it, but in fact, is it the fact that the connectedness associated with software and the ability to do so much at scale and with a few amount of people may in fact be that thing that makes other parts of the world pop the way those did?
Yeah, I don't know that it's inherently different. I mean, Silicon Valley is very good at software, and then the more things become software, like all of a sudden Silicon Valley is good at consumer electronics because they're software-based. My friend Hossein is here, and like the fact that he could build that company already to such scale is just...
It's awesome.
But it's because software has become part of the solution. Like you couldn't build that company if you couldn't easily compete with Korea otherwise. But like I do think it is already. I mean, if you look at China, the big technology. I mean, you know, Huawei, ZTE, Tencent, Alibaba. Like these are pretty big and significant companies. Baidu. I mean, and they're more contained in China than the U.S. companies have been. But like it's clearly possible. And I think that the advantage that they've had is, you know, selling in country. It's a very big country that's growing very fast. And so particularly in markets where, you know, your market and your country is changing extremely rapidly, that it's hard to imagine like that a U.S. company figures that out and then decodes it and is able to, you know, figure out all the laws and the government structure and the consumer behavior and all that better than you could there. So I think those opportunities are real and will definitely continue to happen.
You and Mark have said repeatedly the first rule of Andreessen Horowitz is there are no rules. You started off and still remain highly, highly focused Silicon Valley, but now you've invested around the country for sure. What kinds of things could happen to make you say we're going to have to think about the world differently as investors?
Well, look, always, if somebody becomes an exception, we're invested in Jumio, which is located in Austria, and we're invested in Capriza, which is engineering is based in Israel, and we invested in Skype, of course, which had engineering in Estonia. Like if somebody goes and builds like the winning product and is starting to build the winning company and is like dominating, or like looks like they're just way ahead of the competition, like we'll invest in that in a second. If we're looking for the next company from nothing, and you could say, okay, look, we could have more market share in Silicon Valley, or we could go try and find elsewhere in the world where like we can do that. That's a little harder for us because the other thing that we try to do is be respectful of what we don't know. And we understand like Silicon Valley culture extremely well. It is not the same culture. Like the Skype guys in Estonia did not think about the world in the same way. Just for example, like stock options were far less important to them, and they were more skeptical of them. And partly, a lot of it is from the country history, like, what can you trust? And talking to the guys at Index, Danny Reimer and Mike Volpe, they're like, well, we invest in beer-drinking countries, but not wine-drinking countries. And like these are the things you have to know to succeed globally. And like we know enough to know that we don't know those things. So we stick to our knitting a bit unless, like somebody emerges. And then of course, we would definitely fund it. But for the brand new idea, for those kinds of things, I think we're pretty far away from doing that.
This is why I'm too much of a generalist, because I'm happy to invest in both beer and wine.
Yeah.
I'm totally agnostic.
Yes.
Look, I could keep you for 2 hours, Ben. It's unbelievable to spend some time with you, but we've run out of time. I'm just wondering, you've got this incredible group of entrepreneurs here across spectrums of both technology and not technology who really are building ecosystems to whatever degree within their countries and their regions. Is there one sort of unobvious thing from your experience of being with so many entrepreneurs that's not rah-rah, but really sort of insightful you'd like to leave them with?
I don't have any insights. It's just hard. That's look, John Reed, who's like an old crusty guy who used to run Citigroup, told me when I was starting my company, he goes, Ben, and he ran Citigroup, so he was like very like thoughtful about like economic opportunities and things like that. And he goes, Ben, the only reason to start a company is because you have an irrational desire to do so, because it's not worth the money. And nothing truer had ever been said to me because, we built, that company that I was working on at the time. Opsware ended up selling, I guess 8 years later to Hewlett-Packard for $1.6 billion, and I can tell you it was not worth the money. So hopefully you all have an irrational desire to build a company because that's the only reason to do it.
It's great to spend time with you, man. Thank you.